The question of whether we have free will touches on some of the deepest concerns about human existence. When you make a decision, when you choose one course of action over another, it seems like you could have chosen differently. The choice feels genuinely open, genuinely up to you. This experience of agency, of being the author of your own actions, appears fundamental to how we understand ourselves as persons. Yet philosophers have long questioned whether this experience reflects reality or whether our choices are actually determined by factors beyond our control, whether the feeling of freedom is genuine or illusory. The debate about free will and determinism is not merely academic. It connects to questions about moral responsibility, about whether we can be justly praised or blamed for our actions, about how we should understand human agency and what it means to be a person capable of making choices. The problem of free will arises from an apparent tension between two ideas, both of which seem compelling. On one hand, there is our immediate experience of making choices, of deliberating between options and deciding what to do. This experience seems to involve genuine alternatives, real possibilities among which we select. When you decided what to have for breakfast this morning, it seemed like you could have chosen something different, that multiple futures were open before you and your choice determined which future became actual. This phenomenology of choice, this feeling of freedom and agency, is deeply rooted in human experience. On the other hand, there is the thought that every event has a cause, that nothing happens without some prior condition bringing it about. If you trace back the causes of your breakfast decision, you would find factors like your preferences, your beliefs about nutrition, your past experiences with different foods, perhaps biological factors like hunger level or blood sugar. These factors themselves had causes, stretching back through your personal history, through your upbringing, through genetic and environmental influences that shaped who you are. Following this causal chain far enough brings you to conditions that existed before you were born, factors entirely outside your control. If every event has a cause, and if causes necessitate their effects, then it seems your decision was actually inevitable, given the prior state of the universe. The feeling that you could have chosen differently appears to be an illusion. This is the problem of free will in its most basic form. If determinism is true, if every event is necessitated by prior causes according to natural laws, then it seems our choices are not really free. They are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control. But if determinism is false, if some events occur without sufficient determining causes, then it seems our choices are random or matters of chance rather than expressions of our agency. Either way, genuine freedom seems impossible. Either our actions are determined by prior causes or they are random occurrences, but in neither case do they seem to be truly up to us in the way that free will requires. Different philosophical positions have developed in response to this problem. Determinism holds that in every event, including every human choice and action, is necessitated by prior causes according to natural laws. Given the state of the universe at any moment and the laws of nature, everything that happens thereafter follows inevitably. This view is suggested by classical physics, which describes the universe as governed by deterministic laws where the present state completely determines all future states. If determinism is true, then the history of the universe from the Big Bang onward has unfolded necessarily, including the evolution of life, the development of human civilization, and every thought and action of every person. Libertarianism about free will distinct from political libertarianism, denies determinism and holds that free will requires indeterminism, the falsity of determinism. According to libertarians, genuinely free actions are not determined by prior causes, but involve an agent exercising a special kind of causation that is not itself determined. When you make a free choice, you cause the choice to occur, but your causing of the choice is not itself determined by prior factors. This agent causation is supposed to be different from ordinary event causation, providing a space for genuine freedom in a way that allows you to be the ultimate source of your actions, rather than merely a link in a causal chain stretching back before your birth. Compatibilism takes a different approach, arguing that free will is compatible with determinism, that we can have free will even if all our choices are determined by prior causes. According to compatibilists, what matters for free will is not whether your choices are determined, but whether they are determined in the right way. A choice is free if it flows from your own desires, beliefs, and character, if it is not coerced or compelled by external forces. The fact that your desires and character were themselves shaped by factors outside your control does not undermine your freedom, because freedom is about your choices being yours, being determined by your internal states, not about those internal states being uncaused or self-created. These three positions represent the main contenders in debates about free will, though each has numerous variations and refinements. To understand the debate properly requires examining the arguments for and against each position, the intuitions that support them, and the implications they have for how we understand human agency and moral responsibility. The case for determinism rests partly on scientific considerations. Classical physics, as developed by Newton and refined by later scientists, described a deterministic universe. If you knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe at one moment, and if you knew all the laws of nature, you could in principle calculate the position and momentum of every particle at any future or past moment. The universe unfolds like a vast clockwork mechanism, each state necessarily following from the previous state according to fixed laws. This deterministic picture was challenged by quantum mechanics in the 20th century, which introduced fundamental indeterminacy at the microscopic level. But it is not clear that quantum indeterminacy at the level of subatomic particles affects human decision-making, which involves large-scale neural processes that may average out quantum fluctuations. Beyond physics, the case for determinism draws on everyday observations about causation and explanation. When something happens, we expect it has a cause. When someone acts, we explain their action by reference to their beliefs, desires, motives, and character. These psychological causes are themselves caused by earlier factors, creating a chain of causation that extends back indefinitely. The principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything has an explanation or cause, supports determinism by suggesting there are no uncaused events. To deny determinism is to claim that some events occur without sufficient cause, happen for no reason, which seems implausible or even incoherent. The case for libertarian free will draws primarily on phenomenology and the requirements of moral responsibility. When you deliberate about what to do, it seems that multiple options are genuinely open, that you could choose any of them. That which option is actualized depends on your choice rather than being settled beforehand. This experienced openness of the future, this sense that your decision makes a difference to which possibility becomes actual, is central to how we understand ourselves as agents. If determinism is true, then this experience is radically mistaken. The future is not open, but is already settled, and your deliberation is just a process through which the predetermined outcome is revealed to you. Moreover, libertarians argue, moral responsibility requires that you could have done otherwise, that alternative possibilities were genuinely available. It seems unfair to hold someone responsible for an action if they could not have done anything different, if their action was inevitable, given factors beyond their control. The principle that ought implies can, that you are obligated to do only what you are able to do, suggests that moral responsibility presupposes freedom to do otherwise. If determinism is true, and you could not have acted differently than you did, then it seems you cannot be held truly responsible for your actions. These libertarian arguments face significant challenges. The phenomenology of freedom, the feeling that you could have chosen differently, might be unreliable. Many psychological studies suggest that we have less conscious control over our choices than we think, that decisions are often made unconsciously before we become aware of having decided. The feeling of making a free choice might be generated after the fact, a post hoc rationalization rather than an accurate report of the decision process. Furthermore, it is not clear that indeterminism, even if true, actually provides the kind of freedom needed for responsibility. If your choices are not determined by your character and desires, but occur randomly or by chance, in what sense are they truly your choices? Random choices seem no more attributable to you than determined choices. The problem of agent causation illustrates this difficulty. Libertarians often appeal to agent causation to explain how free will is possible. The agent, the person, is supposed to be a cause of their choices in a special way that is not itself causally determined. But it is difficult to make sense of this notion. If the agent's causing of the choice is itself caused by prior factors, then we are back to determinism. If the agent's causing is not caused by anything, then it seems random or arbitrary. Saying that the agent simply causes without being caused appears to be more a placeholder than an explanation, a way of labeling what needs to be explained rather than actually explaining it. Compatibilism attempts to avoid these difficulties by redefining what free will requires. According to compatibilists, asking whether you could have done otherwise in the sense of whether alternative possibilities were metaphysically open, given the exact prior conditions, is the wrong question. The relevant question is whether your action was determined by your own desires and beliefs, whether it flowed from your character and values, whether it was the result of your own decision-making process, rather than being compelled by external forces. Freedom is not about having alternatives in an absolute metaphysical sense, but about being the source of your actions in the right way. Consider the difference between choosing to stay home because you want to read a book and staying home because someone has locked you in. In both cases, you stay home and there is no alternative possibility, given the circumstances. But the first case involves freedom, while the second does not. The difference is that in the first case, your staying home flows from your own desires, while in the second, it is externally compelled. Compatibilists argue that this difference is what matters for freedom and responsibility, not whether the causal chain that led to your desires could have gone differently. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, articulated an early version of compatibilism by distinguishing between liberty and necessity. Liberty does not require the absence of causation, but rather requires the absence of constraint. A free action is one that is caused by the agent's own will rather than being forced or prevented by external obstacles. The fact that the will itself is caused by prior factors does not undermine freedom, because freedom consists in actions being caused by the will, not in the will being uncaused. This human compatibilism has been developed and refined by many subsequent philosophers, though it faces objections of its own. The main objection to compatibilism is that it does not capture genuine freedom or responsibility. If your desires and character were shaped entirely by factors outside your control, by genetics and environment and upbringing, then it seems you are not truly responsible for actions that flow from those desires and character. Even if your actions are not externally compelled, they are still the inevitable results of factors you did not choose and could not control. True responsibility, critics argue, requires that you could have done otherwise in a robust sense that is incompatible with determinism. A compatibilist account of freedom might capture something important about autonomy or self-determination, but it does not capture the deeper freedom that moral responsibility requires. This objection often appeals to manipulation cases. Imagine that neuroscientists could directly manipulate your brain, implanting desires and beliefs that deterministically lead you to perform certain actions. You would act on your own desires and beliefs, satisfying the compatibilist criteria for freedom, but intuitively you would not be truly responsible because your desires were manipulated. Compatibilists respond that manipulation cases differ from normal causation in relevant ways, that there is a difference between desires formed through normal developmental processes and desires implanted artificially. But it is not clear what makes this difference morally relevant if both processes are equally deterministic. The concept of moral responsibility is central to debates about free will. We hold people responsible for their actions, praising good actions and blaming bad ones, rewarding some behaviors and punishing others. This practice of holding people responsible seems to presuppose that they had some kind of control over their actions, that their actions were genuinely up to them in some sense. If determinism is true, and all actions are inevitable consequences of prior causes, does this undermine moral responsibility? Different positions give different answers. Hard determinism accepts determinism and concludes that moral responsibility is an illusion. We are not truly responsible for our actions because we could not have done otherwise. The practice of praising and blaming people, while perhaps useful for modifying future behavior, is not justified by genuine desert. People do not deserve praise or blame in a deep metaphysical sense, because their actions were inevitable given factors beyond their control. This view can seem liberating, removing the burden of guilt and resentment, but it can also seem to undermine important aspects of moral life and interpersonal relationships. Libertarians maintain that moral responsibility requires indeterministic free will, that we can be held responsible only if we could have done otherwise in a strong sense incompatible with determinism. This preserves the connection between responsibility and control, but faces the problems with indeterminism and agent causation mentioned earlier. If free will requires indeterminism, and if physics suggests determinism, or at least does not provide the right kind of indeterminism, then libertarianism may be committed to a metaphysically extravagant view of human agency that is difficult to reconcile with our scientific understanding of how the world works. Compatibilists argue that moral responsibility does not require the kind of absolute freedom that incompatibilists demand. Responsibility is compatible with determinism, because what matters is that actions flow from the agent's own character and are responsive to reasons and incentives. We hold people responsible to influence their future behavior and the behavior of others, and this practice makes sense even in a deterministic world. Responsibility is about the agent's relationship to their action, about whether they acted for reasons and could have responded to different reasons, not about whether the laws of nature necessitated that they have those particular reasons and make that particular response. The debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists about responsibility is partly empirical and partly conceptual. Empirical questions include whether folk intuitions about responsibility presuppose the ability to do otherwise in an absolute sense, and whether learning about determinism changes people's judgments about responsibility. Conceptual questions include what it means to say someone deserves praise or blame, what purposes punishment serves, and whether there is a single concept of responsibility or multiple concepts serving different purposes. The relationship between free will and moral luck raises additional complications. Moral luck occurs when factors beyond an agent's control affect the moral evaluation of their actions. Two drunk drivers drive home recklessly. One hits a pedestrian and kills them. The other arrives home safely. Both acted equally recklessly and irresponsibly, yet we typically judge the one who killed someone more harshly. This seems to show that moral evaluation depends on factors beyond the agent's control, on matters of luck. This is puzzling if responsibility requires control, because it suggests we hold people responsible for things they did not control. Different types of moral luck are distinguished. Resultant luck involves how things turn out, as in the drunk driver example. Circumstantial luck involves the situations we find ourselves in, which affect what opportunities for action we have. Constitutive luck involves our character and personality, which affect how we respond to situations. If we acknowledge moral luck, this complicates the relationship between control and responsibility. If we deny moral luck, this conflicts with common moral judgments and practices. The problem of moral luck shows that our intuitions about responsibility are more complex than simple principles about control and ability to do otherwise might suggest. The development of neuroscience has brought empirical perspectives to debates about free will. Brain imaging studies have shown that neural activity associated with decisions begins before subjects report becoming conscious of having made the decision. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments found that readiness potentials, patterns of brain activity that predict which action will be performed, begin several hundred milliseconds before subjects report consciously deciding to act. This has been interpreted by some as showing that decisions are made unconsciously before we become aware of them, that conscious will is an illusion generated after the fact. These interpretations are contested. Critics argue that readiness potentials may reflect preparation or urges rather than actual decisions, that the timing of conscious awareness is difficult to measure precisely, that a slight delay between unconscious and conscious processing does not undermine agency. Nevertheless, neuroscience has reinforced deterministic thinking, for some, by suggesting that mental events are neural events, that every thought and decision corresponds to specific patterns of brain activity that follow from prior brain states according to neurobiological laws. The relationship between reasons and causes in explaining action is debated. When you explain why someone did something by citing their reasons, are you giving a causal explanation, or is reason explanation different in kind from causal explanation? Donald Davidson argued that reasons are causes, that when you act for a reason, that reason causes your action. This view supports a naturalistic understanding of human agency as part of the causal order. Others have argued that reason explanation involves interpreting actions in light of norms of rationality rather than identifying causes, that understanding why someone did something requires grasping how they saw their situation and what made sense from their perspective, which is different from identifying causal mechanisms. If reasons are causes and all causes are determined, then it seems reason-responsive action is compatible with determinism. Your action can be rational, responsive to good reasons, even if you're having those reasons and responding to them as you did was inevitable given prior conditions. Compatibilists often appeal to reason's responsiveness as the key to freedom and responsibility. What matters is whether you could have responded differently if you had been presented with different reasons or incentives, not whether you could have responded differently given the exact actual reasons you had. The concept of autonomy, of being self-governing or self-determined, is related to but distinct from free will. You might lack free will in some absolute metaphysical sense, but still be autonomous if you act according to your own values and authentic preferences, rather than being manipulated or coerced by others. Some philosophers argue that autonomy is what really matters for moral and political purposes, that questions about whether the universe is deterministic are less important than questions about whether individuals are able to live according to their own conception of the good life, and whether social institutions respect and support this capacity. Hierarchical theories of autonomy, developed by philosophers like Harry Frankfurt, hold that autonomy involves having certain attitudes toward your own desires. You are autonomous when you have second-order desires about your first-order desires, when you want to have certain wants and not others, and when your first-order desires align with your second-order desires. A drug addict who wants to quit but cannot control their drug. Use lacks autonomy because their first-order desire for drugs conflicts with their second-order desire not to want drugs. Someone who acts according to values they endorse and identify with possesses autonomy, even if their values and endorsements were shaped by causal factors beyond their control. The concept of sourcehood, of being the source or origin of your actions, is also relevant. Some incompatibilists argue that responsibility requires ultimate sourcehood, requires that you be the ultimate cause of your actions in a way that traces back only to you and not to factors outside you. If causal chains extend back before your birth, then you cannot be the ultimate source of your actions, and you cannot be truly responsible. Compatibilists respond that being the proximate source, being the immediate cause whose character and desires produce the action, is sufficient for responsibility even if you are not the ultimate source. Questions about free will connect to questions about personal identity and the self. If you are not really an agent who makes choices, but just a series of causally connected mental states, what unifies these states into a single person? What makes you the same person over time if there is no enduring agent underlying the changes? Conversely, if there is a substantial self that persists through time and makes choices, what is this self, and how does it relate to the physical body and brain? These metaphysical questions about the nature of persons affect how we should think about agency and responsibility. The implications of denying free will, whether through accepting hard determinism or hard incompatibilism, would be far-reaching if taken seriously. It would affect the criminal justice system, where punishment is typically justified partly by reference to desert and responsibility. It would affect interpersonal relationships, where gratitude, resentment, admiration, and contempt all seem to presuppose that people are responsible for their actions. It would affect personal deliberation, where wondering what to do seems to presuppose that different outcomes are possible depending on what you decide. Some philosophers argue that even if free will is an illusion, we cannot help but believe in it and act as if we have it. The experience of deliberation, of weighing reasons and making choices, is inescapable as long as we are agents who act for reasons. P.F. Strawson argued that reactive attitudes like gratitude, resentment, love, and hurt feelings are natural human responses that we could not abandon even if we became convinced that determinism is true and responsibility is an illusion. These attitudes are too deeply embedded in human psychology and social life to be revised away by philosophical arguments. Others maintain that we could develop alternative attitudes and practices that do not presuppose responsibility in the traditional sense. We could view people's actions as symptoms of character and circumstance rather than as deserving praise or blame. We could replace punishment aimed at retribution with measures aimed at protection and rehabilitation. We could cultivate compassion and understanding for wrongdoers rather than moral indignation. Whether such a revision of our attitudes and practices is psychologically possible or socially desirable remains contested. The question of whether free will is compatible with determinism partly depends on how free will is defined. If free will requires the ability to do otherwise in an absolute metaphysical sense, with alternative possibilities being genuinely open given the exact prior state of the universe, then it seems incompatible with determinism. If free will requires only that actions flow from the agent's own character and are responsive to reasons, then it may be compatible with determinism. Whether either definition captures what we really care about when we care about freedom and responsibility is part of what is at stake in the debate. Some philosophers have proposed that we should distinguish multiple concepts of freedom, each relevant to different concerns. There might be a concept of freedom relevant to moral responsibility, a concept relevant to political liberty, a concept relevant to psychological well-being, and these different concepts might have different requirements. One might be compatible with determinism, while another is not. Rather than asking whether free will exists implicita, we should ask which specific freedoms exist and which matters most for various purposes. The debate about free will illustrates how philosophical questions can be both deeply abstract and practically significant. Abstract questions about causation, determinism, agency, and responsibility connect to practical questions about how we should treat ourselves and others, how we should design institutions, how we should understand human nature. The debate continues because intelligent and informed philosophers disagree, not because some are confused or ignorant. The difficulty of the problem, the way arguments can be marshaled for competing positions, suggests that the question of free will may not admit of a simple definitive answer, but requires ongoing careful thinking about what we value, what science reveals about human nature, and how we should understand ourselves as agents in a causal world. Perhaps the most important lesson from the free will debate is recognizing the complexity of human agency and the multiple factors, both internal and external, that shape our choices and actions. Whether these factors amount to determinism, whether determinism undermines responsibility, whether compatibilist freedom is sufficient, these questions may not have final answers that everyone can agree on, but engaging with them deepens our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to make choices, what it means to hold ourselves and others accountable. The philosophical investigation continues, not because philosophers are making no progress, but because the questions are genuinely difficult and the stakes are genuinely high.